Pete DuPont, modified a little bit by Governor Castle, and they served us well for a number of years. But what they ended up allowing us to do is kind of seesaw up and down with the revenue estimates that comes in. We have one of the best systems in the country for establishing the starting point, which is the estimated revenues that come from DFAC. But historically, the governor and the legislature have been limited by the 98% rule, 98% of the estimated revenues. And what has allowed us to do is when we had revenue surges, and we have them often, we could appropriate into that revenue bubble. And then when we have significant declines, and I'll show you a graph in a minute that illustrates that challenge, then you end up either having to raise taxes or cut spending or some combination of the two, much like what was presented with my administration when we took office 7 years ago. We were looking at a $350 million to $400 million deficit, and it was really a function of those declining revenues at that period of time. So we changed the approach. We came up, and these are the kind of the three tools that we use. We use a benchmark spending target that's established by the DFAC, and it's a combination of inflation measures of government inflation, population growth, median income growth, that type of thing. So it targets a spending level that is could be above or below the particular revenue estimate that we have from DFAC in that a given year. If it's above if our revenue is above the benchmark or above our budget, we have the budget stabilization and responsible budgeting, where we really direct one-time revenue into the capital budget, other one-time expenses, and the budget stabilization fund. So you'll see in a minute now where here's the type of thing that was our approach was geared to address. You can see the wide swing in revenue. That's the gold line. Back in FY 18-19, we had a little bit of a revenue bubble. Our targeted spending was below that, as you can see. Then during the pandemic, the revenue went down again. We kept a kind of a modest increase in our budget, but above the revenue number. And then we had this tremendous spike coming out of COVID, and we didn't spend all of that. If we spent all that money, or if we appropriated it to operating budget growth, we'd be in a really bad situation right now. Instead, we stayed the course with, you can see what's about 4 or 5%, 6% operating budget growth, and now a tick up this year, mostly because of our commitment for the Public Education Compensation Commission recommendation. That's a big number, and you'll see in a minute, but we're clearly looking at a divide there where we're going to look to use the Budget Stabilization Act if revenues don't return at a higher level. Right now, that's the current out-year estimate from DFAC. And so you can see if you take a more modest approach across on your operating budget growth, you do a better job getting through the ups and downs of the revenues that come in, and they tend to do this historically. If you go back and look over the past 30 years, you see something like this, except you'll see the spending growth tends to follow the operating revenue, because that's the way the rules were established. So here's what our financial plan looks like. Not dissimilar to what you see in a given year. We fully fund the rainy day fund, have to on day one, 5% of anticipated revenues. It's never been touched, by the way, which is why we have the Budget Stabilization Fund, something that we can go to when revenues soften and we need some support for the budget. Appropriating it less than 98%, considerably less than that. Budget growth, it's above the DFAC benchmark, but again, targeted towards something other than the revenue number. We've maintained the Budget Stabilization Fund now at $410 million, so we've got a fund to go to in subsequent years when those revenues soften. In the past, we wouldn't have that. We would have spent all that in the operating budget, and then we'd have a significant hill to climb after that. Again, $256 million, $57 million of cash to the bond bill. That's a huge number, but compared to the last couple of years, it kind of pales in comparison. But if you look historically, Jack, I mean, that number, we're lucky if we had, some millions of dollars to put in cash to the capital. We have a lot of things now that are in our capital budget that aren't bonded. And so we do have a need for cash to cover that. So these are the big numbers: $6 billion operating budget growth at over 8%. The target was more like 6% grant and aid, cash to the bond bill, one-time supplemental. The highlights are pretty much as what you would expect: strengthening our economy. We still have those funds to really help when we have somebody we want to bring to Delaware, or somebody that wants to expand in our state. We're able to do that to create jobs, because if your economy is not creating jobs, you're not going to have the revenue you need for all these priorities that we have. That's what drives it, is that growing economy. Investing in our public schools, clearly the biggest part of this budget, and the salary piece of it, the biggest part of that. Supporting families with child care and daycare, a big priority for ours. And you'll see we're up well over $130 million total. When I was lieutenant governor, the state wasn't investing anything really in child care. So working families, we're getting a boost now, as that $15 minimum wage starts to go up each year. It'll be the full 15, I think, in another 12 months. And so that's making a difference for families. And the market, by the way, has blown right through that. I mean, the needs of businesses to hire people, even in state government, has blown through the $15 minimum, and then significant investments in environmental protection, addressing climate change. So here are the big pictures: compensation, the competitive compensation, both of state employees, and importantly, the $60,000 a year goal for starting salaries. This is driven in part by competition from the state of Maryland, which put that target out a couple years ago, where we have a lot of vacancies in teaching positions across our state, and we need to be competitive moving forward. I mentioned the early childhood education, child care investments. We've expanded investments in purchase of care. Those are families that need that assistance the most. We've increased funding for opportunity funding for low-income students and English learners, and then investments in our economic development, our infrastructure, and safe communities as well. Do have some investments in the climate change prevention, clean water, and environmental initiatives. And then this big one, the last one, is really a tough one, because we have to add, just to open the doors, nearly $200 million in healthcare cost inflation. Half of that, say $100 million or thereabouts of that, is our half of Medicaid. And the other half of that is for state employees and retirees. And every dollar that we have to put in play in healthcare is something that we can't spend in childcare and supports for teachers in classrooms and all that type of thing. So something we really have to focus on. Part of it is the so-called unwinding that's happened in Medicaid, where we got preferred reimbursements from the feds during the pandemic. That was unwound. The eligibility as well. They took the money away before we had to unwind the folks from the rolls here in Delaware. So that created a hit for Medicaid, and some really difficult estimates to develop there. So I'm going to turn it over to Saran. He's going to go over to some of the big buckets, things that you're all familiar with. Again, I want to thank legislators for attending today. Thanks for your anticipated good work over the next several months. And again, a real thank you for Saran and his team, who've done a tremendous job.
Thank you, Governor. All right, so it's my job to go through the meat and potatoes of this. Our public education budget is at about $2.1 billion this year. That's about a third of our total operating budget. This current budget includes a $10 million increase for
switching.
Okay. $10 million increase for opportunity funding. That brings the total of the opportunity fund to $63 million. The administration has set a goal of getting to $60 million by FY25, and so we've exceeded that goal. Public education salary increases. This budget includes $45 million, which includes the first year and also includes step increases as well. Also, student unit growth. This budget includes covers about 325 new units, $56.5 million in total. So as the governor mentioned, it's been a huge priority, education, but specifically early childhood education in this administration. The total budget for early childhood education is at $135 million right now. If you jump to the bottom of that screen, you'll see the growth over this administration, going from FY17, where it was a $32 million operating budget for purchase of care, to now $83 million. I want to definitely give a shout out to Joint Finance Committee and the chairs for for assisting with that increase as well. Also in ECAP, $6 million starting in FY17 to $16 million this year, and that only includes our general fund spending and does not include federal funding as well. Budget also includes $129.6 million for environmental and climate action initiatives. Now, this total does include general fund and federal funding. We have some breakouts in the bottom of those boxes, but just to highlight a few areas of import, you have $20 million for ag land preservation and open space, $10 million for each of those, and $32.8 million in general funds for clean water initiatives up and down the state as we try to leverage more federal funding for those necessary projects. Next slide. I'm going to turn this one over to Rick because our economic development investments have had a major and continue to have a major impact on our revenues. So, Secretary Geisenberg.
So, as the governor said, jobs and economic growth are important for lots of reasons, but for purposes of today, it's because it drives our revenue growth. You can see in the bottom there, 32,100 net jobs have been added during this administration. That's the best growth. That's the best job growth in the past 20 years, and it's not really an accident. It's really been a conscious effort making economic development a partnership between the state and the private sector, starting with the creation of the Delaware Prosperity Partnership in 2017 and working on landing lots of singles and doubles rather than the expenses associated with trying to swing for those home runs, investing in programs that support Ready and Six so that we can respond quickly to job growth opportunities, things like the Strategic Fund, the Graduated Lab Space Fund, the Site Readiness Fund, and the Transportation Infrastructure Fund, and then also investing in research partnerships, and there's many of them, but one big one here is the National Institute for Innovation in Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing and their planned Sabre facility, planned down at the University of Delaware, which will test and demonstrate best manufacturing practices. More importantly, it's leveraged over $600 million in federal and private investments. So for a small amount of money, seems like a lot of money, but for a small amount of money, we're attracting lots and lots of federal and state money to match it. So really important, and really important ultimately for our revenue growth.
Thank you, Rick. So investing in our state workforce, this was also one of those 4 buckets of priorities. Just to put this in context, I think everybody recognizes that as we got through the Great Recession, there were a lot of necessary administrative changes that occurred in order to help us weather that storm. One of those was a lot of pay freezes. To balance the playing field and help us become a little bit more competitive when it comes to wages, so we can fill a lot of vacant positions in areas where there's an incredible need. So this budget includes $122.2 million for that purpose, dedicated to competitive wages. This is a 2% increase across the board for state employees, and also covers funding negotiated wages of collective bargaining agreements this year. Just to put a fine point on what I said before, since FY17, the average state employee's annual salary has increased by 31%. And so again, this budget also includes historic wage increases for public education employees that follows a huge increase last year, but specifically to get these starting salaries for teachers to $60,000 a year. Budget also includes investments for recruitment and retention initiatives in many of those hard to fill areas that I mentioned before. Next slide. Okay, healthcare costs. So outside of wages, we also have to make sure that we're continuing to fund healthcare for our active employees and our retirees. This year, we are seeing in the end year a shortfall in our group health insurance program, which we will have to address. This budget, though, focused on FY25, is dedicated to trying to address next year's projected revenue shortfall. So this budget sets aside $93.9 million for the group health insurance plan. Obviously, that number could grow. It's based on where the fund was a few months ago. And we have a couple more SEBC meetings coming up in the next few months. But this budget does include $93.9 million to address next year's projected shortfall. Also includes $56.1 million of extraordinary revenues to other post-employment benefits, specifically to the OPEB trust fund. I want to thank the General Assembly for SB 175, which is codified what the administration has been doing over the last couple of years, which is setting aside 1% of the operating budget toward the OPEB liability. This is not a complete solution to our OPEB liability issues, but it is one tool in the toolbox. Next slide. Yeah. Go.
So this is a big one, $2 billion on healthcare. And again, that's a combination between Medicare and insurance for state employees and retirees, $200 million increase from FY24 to 25. It's nearly 40% of our operating budget. This is an item that had been a priority if we had established a priority of ours starting the administration, try to get our arms around healthcare cost inflation, not just for state employees, not just for Medicaid, but for businesses across our state. Obviously, we had a pandemic in between that kind of set those back. But this is something that we got to start really thinking hard about and working on. It's not something that we're going to solve in the next 12 months of my administration, but it's something that all of us in this room, legislators and others, need to focus on, if both for the sake of the businesses that pay most of the healthcare costs, the state of Delaware that pays a significant portion of the healthcare costs for state employees, retirees, and our half of Medicaid. This is a big item, and it's sucking down a lot of resources that could otherwise go to all the different priorities that I know members of the General Assembly have. So this is just something that we need to focus on together and find ways to address it.
Thank you. So it's my job to say what he said, but just in a more boring way. As you look at the pie chart, to the governor's point, the 18% reflects our Medicaid growth. The 21% on this slide showcases our active employee and retiree healthcare. So you can see this is just below 40% of our total growth in this year's budget, and it really eats away at some of these other areas where, obviously the legislature and administration would want to dedicate more resources. So education and other items up and down the state. So unless we're able to get our hands around growing costs of healthcare, and it's not something just state government, as the governor mentioned, dealing with, folks in the private sector, nonprofits, and all around the state are dealing with this in the country as well. Next slide. So this basically says everything that we just said. Healthcare costs will continue to crowd out other investments. Next slide. Okay. So I mentioned before early childhood development. I mentioned some of the areas, but I'll put a finer point on some of those. So this budget includes purchase of care expansion of family eligibility, getting that threshold up to 200% of the federal poverty level. Right now, it is at 185% of the federal poverty level. This is a $6.1 million investment that should provide access to over 600 new children. Budget also includes a $3.5 million increase for a total of $15.7 million in ECAP, the Early Childhood Assistance Program, and that adds 200 plus seats for early care and education for infants, toddlers, 3-year-old and 4-year-old children. And as I mentioned before, the growth in those areas over the administration below. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned the $10 million increase for opportunity funding, bringing that fund to $63 million. Also, this budget continues a $20.2 million investment from last year related to the Wilmington Learning Collaborative and the Reading Consortium, $17.3 million in mental health services for elementary and middle school and high school students, and $3 million in statewide literacy coaches. Higher ed. This budget, the capital component of this budget provides $30 million in deferred maintenance costs and capital improvements for capital improvements and technology upgrades to our big three, UD, Dell State, and Dell Tech. $1.4 million to support University of Delaware and Dell State's joint engineering program. We supported Dell State's last year. Now we're focused on UD's component this year. Budget also includes just under $1 million for year 4 of Dell Tech's compensation stabilization plan, which we will have to continue to focus on as we continue to increase public education salaries over the next 4 years. Also includes investments in our scholarship programs at our universities. I'll go down the line on these, but $2.5 million for First State Promise. $1 million increase Inspire at DSU. These scholarships supported 6,400 students last year. All right, healthier state and environment and agriculture. We mentioned earlier the $32.8 million for clean water investments to really leverage a lot of the federal resources that are out there for our clean water projects up and down the state. Another $4 million for the cover crop investment, also dedicated to improving water quality. $3.5 million for lead assessment and remediation efforts up and down the state. $3.2 million for conservation cost share to expand water quality improvements and protect human health, and $2 million to support HB 87, which is Agricultural Production Insurance Assistance Program that was introduced in the legislature last year. So the governor mentioned the $257 million in cash that's being dedicated to our capital budget. I mentioned that it's still high, yet significantly less than some of the years where we had a lot of extraordinary revenue, but we're still able to dedicate that funding to our major priorities, top of which is school construction and renovation at $169.5 million. I won't hit all of these, but I'll hit the big lines. Rick mentioned investing in small business and infrastructure, the $25 million in research collaborations and grants. Next slide. Building strong communities. Over the last few years, especially since ARPA came in to play, there's been a dedicated effort to improve our libraries and improve our library system. These dollars go to leverage more of those resources to continue those efforts up and down the state. We also continue to make investments in affordable housing. Last year, we dedicated about $1 million between federal and state resources toward affordable housing efforts. And this year, we continue to support those efforts as well. Also, when it comes to protecting our natural resources for future generations, these resources do include our Clean Water Trust Fund investments. I mentioned farmland preservation and open space, but also $4 million dedicated for electric vehicle infrastructure on our state roads, which is also an incredibly important effort. Next slide. All right. Kent and Sussex County courthouses, we continue to make these investments. Those courthouses should be prepared to begin to open next year. But this investment should be the final investment, barring any market pressure or other concerns. Also, $26 million for DSP Troop 4, Leonard L. Williams Justice Center, and Customs House projects, $30 million in Wilmington for those two court facilities. And I skipped over to $17.7 million for statewide correctional facilities and safety improvements. Commissioner, sorry for skipping that one. Building strong foundation for our state, $37 million for agencies, minor capital improvements and deferred maintenance, but probably the more important one, especially with a lot of our folks in the General Assembly and communities in Newcastle County, is Emily Bissell, making a $22 million investment for a forensic science center that we plan to build there over the next few years. All right, so now we're back to our top lines, just over $6 billion operating budget. just under a $1 billion capital budget. I think in years past, we were around 1.3 and ended some years at $1.4 billion capital budget. This year, a little bit slimmer, but still incredibly important. $91 million in our one-time supplemental. 56 million of that is a one-time investment to the, well, not a one-time investment, touching the 410 million in the budget stabilization fund, which based on flat revenues and some of these increasing costs that we've mentioned is probably going to be something that we're going to need to dip into next year and in the out years in order to present a balanced budget to you again. Okay, Gov.
Should be one more slide.
My bad. There we go. Unless you want to go over the schedule. So we'll start with January. Senator Pardee, Representative Williams. We start those next week, and those will last through February. Then we'll have bond bill committee hearings. Senator Walsh is here, our chair of bond bill, co-chair now of bond bill in April. And we'll go through markup in May and hopefully have a budget that has been passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor by June 1st. Thank you.
Again, thanks, Saran and his team. Put your hands together for Saran and their team for all their good work. Help me thank Pam, who's here, their sign language expert, for helping us through this. Again, thank you for coming. We look forward to the engagement with members of the General Assembly, and we'll take questions afterwards. Thanks again. Thanks for coming.